All right, we are live. A few minutes
We
late,
are
but we're
live.
still we're
Sorry,
good.
folks. I had to make my coffee,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then I accidentally shut us down. Um,
That's all right.
so, uh, yeah. Um,
All right.
oh, we have to do our intro, right? So,
Yeah. Intro.
I guess I'll start,
You want to
and
start?
then sure. Greetings, Doug. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you, John?
I'm okay now that I have my coffee.
Now you have your
Uh,
coffee. Yes, we'll get to
yeah,
that eventually, right?
yeah, eventually. And So just so you know, folks, and we've talked about this once before, at least, you know, we kind of decide what we're going to talk about 3 minutes before we start recording. Although, the Doug did throw something out yesterday or the day before, and I thought, well, that could be interesting. And so what is the topic? Art, Buddhism and
Art.
art, Buddhism, and
Yeah.
which has a lot of different ways we can go for it. But since you're the one that put it forth, I'm curious to know sort of what brought it in for you, what sort of made it alive for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so many reasons. One reason is that I love art. Art is something that visual art in particular, but music
And
as
your
well
mom's an
is.
artist,
My mom's an artist. My dad is interested in music. So, yeah,
right?
it's something that's always been, on the top of my head. And I enjoy Buddhist art in particular. Now, the what makes it particularly interesting is that especially with the early material, there is a pretty deep, I wouldn't say antipathy maybe, but there are difficulties with aspects of art if you look at the early Dharma. And so this kind of, I think that this makes for an interesting tension here, which,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's of course 2,500 years ago there was certainly art, but there was entertainment, um, and who knows, right? Really, but was there wasn't necessarily what we might consider, quote, and this may sound this may not sound come out right, but there wasn't necessarily what we would call, quote, high art. In other words, artists weren't necessarily creating for posterity, or they didn't think they were creating for posterity. They were creating for, spiritual purposes, which is where a lot of the, art comes from, of course, and practical purposes, and then to some degree in terms of visual and not visual, but performance art, whether it's theater or music, it was for entertainment and in some cases maybe even communication. I don't know, but so the relationship that the public would have to art would be different than they wouldn't go to museums, in other words, and look at art. They wouldn't
right.
go to a concert hall and listen to a concert, or a theater and listen to theater. So that relationship is different. And then, in the Vinaya, and I don't know how it came about, right? It is very much a precept of no dancing,
No singing.
no singing, no wearing of chanting. Of course, is cool,
Mhm.
but no wearing of jewelry. Things like that that kind of imply that these are. Well, it's an interesting. What is that implying? That these things are bad? That we have. It attracts us in a way that is dangerous. So it also relates to the sensory experience and sense desire.
Right. Yeah, no, and so much of art as we experience it is sensual. It's through the senses. It's a sensual
Yeah,
experience. And I think we have to be, of course, clear that in the modern world, we have a very different relationship to art than people did even 300 years ago or 200
sure,
years ago.
absolutely.
It's a very modern idea that art is, the creation of, a genius who has discovered something new and is revealing it to the world on paint, in paint or whatever, in sculpture or whatever, or in music. That's a very modern idea, and of course, nothing like that existed in any of the ancient world, much less
Right,
in
right,
in
right.
ancient India.
I mean,
Um,
that's our assumption, but it seems that way. Yeah,
right. No, I think it
we don't
does.
really know.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's that, and so then there's like how um, how do we experience art now,
Mm,
as you know, and how does our practice change the way? Has it changed the way we experienced art? Has it changed our
right.
interest in art?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and not even not talking about Buddhist art at all in this context, but just art and receiving something that is uh, appealing to the senses, or at least involving the senses to a great extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we
Yeah.
receive it? And I mean, it's interesting. I was um, had a friend visiting last week, and we went to the Whitney Biennial, the Whitney Museum Biennial in New York, and the biennial, for those of you that are not familiar, it's basically a curated exhibition that happens every 2 years at the Whitney Museum. You know, of very recent art, and much of it this year was related to technology and AI, and it was quite almost too conceptual for my blood. There was I had to go through a lot of stuff that I didn't really appreciate or that didn't move me in any particular way before I got to two paintings that blew me away in a sense, and they were the most, in a way, the most conservative paintings in the whole exhibit because they were just paintings.
Mm-hmm.
They were, I wouldn't say they were abstract at all, but and they were by a Bosnian artist, and one in particular, it was just like opening up to that painting, which was of kind of image of a solitary being in a vast sort of space of color. And there was just something, you know, just kind of receiving that in a way without putting a narration on it, a narrative on it, you know, was in itself a form of meditation, of course, you know, just kind of opening to the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so, uh, you know, we can appreciate things in that way, you know, and what's interesting, I find that uh, there's a famous quote of, I may have brought this in once before. There was a quote from Picasso, you know, who somebody would say to him, what is the meaning of this painting, you know? He said, "What do you mean? What is, you know, what is your experience of the painting? It's not about." And of course, some of his paintings definitely had meaning or a narrative sort of link to it. But you know, he wasn't. His painting was a reflection of his experience of whatever that narrative might have been. And so,
Right.
what is our experience of his painting? You know, unrelated to the narrative, even. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and or anybody's painting, and how is it received by us when we drop the need for a narrative, when we drop the need for an identification, etc., which
Right.
brings up all sorts of, you know, interesting, uh,
Right. And interesting problems. I mean,
yeah,
um, I mean, a lot of this also is very modern. I think this idea, first of all, like you say, that many modern artists sort of want to get beyond the idea of a narrative, beyond the idea that a painting has a meaning or a sense or trying to teach us something. Also, very modern idea that the paintings or music or art in general should not be beautiful. That the idea that that calling something beautiful is almost a criticism of the piece, which I've read in a number of places, you know, of contemporary art
mm,
nowadays. That, you know, that to say that a piece is beautiful is to say that it's only decorative, that it's, you know, serves a
wow,
decorative purpose, and
yeah,
therefore is of lesser value than a piece which one would not describe as beautiful. And you know, and if you go back a few hundred years, even in the West, and India as well, and so much, we might even say almost all the art was to an extent didactic. Of
Mm.
course, you have art in the context of Christianity or in many religions, Islam, but of course in Buddhism as well. So much Buddhist art is didactic; it's trying to teach us something. The tankas or the mandalas are trying to teach us. I mean, they're in a certain way uh, roadmaps to meditative experience in certain ways.
Right. Well,
And
mandalas certainly are. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And
for sure.
or teaching us, the various bodhisattvas associated with each other, and
Mhm. Yeah.
their all of their different attributes and so on. And they were, many of them, very stylized. In other words, there was a formula for how they were supposed to be painted, um, which, when I take, somebody from contemporary art, as I've done in the past, they look at it, it's like, but this is very repetitive. It's very, it's like, but that's a different way of looking at art, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we have to, I mean, there's so many layers here, in the sense that when we look at art nowadays, we're looking with very different eyes than say somebody would have
Well, when you're
centuries.
talking about looking at art from centuries ago,
Right, exactly.
yeah, of course we're looking at it from different eyes,
Yeah.
and even music. I mean, it's fascinating. Some people may realize that I was in the music business for many years, and one of the groups that I worked for decades was the Tallis Scholars, the vocal ensemble from England, who I know you're a
I
fan
love
of.
them. They're
And
wonderful. Yeah.
this is music that's exclusively, generally speaking, it's exclusively sacred music written for the church,
Yeah.
polyphonic. And I don't think people are in love with the group because of the words, right? They're in love with the group because of the sound, or the music because of the sound and the amazing, how that sound is experienced.
Mhm.
And of course, the same would have been true in church, but in the context of a church and in the context of the service that it would have come from, it would have been received slightly differently, perhaps.
I would think
Although
so.
it can be as much a religious experience without that, in the other spiritual experience, right? That something in us is moved, and there's a bodily experience in the receiving of it. And so when we talk about other musics and purely instrumental music, that evolved over the centuries, right? It's like where no words are attached, but yet there's still an incredible spiritual experience that might be as it's received by certain, by individuals. It's a very individualistic thing. Although, when you're in a concert hall, experiencing something with 1,000 other people, there's also that. So there's both the individual and the collective experience, which in itself is a fascinating place of practice, frankly. And how is our body receiving it? It's funny, I have a book downstairs that I've just pulled out. My French isn't very good, so I'm only getting some of it, but it was a mindfulness. It was compiled by a mindfulness teacher in France, and it's about how we can bring, how do we how can we directly how do we experience art through the quality of mindfulness? When we let the conceptual mind drop away completely and just be with the experience of whatever it is we're looking at, or whatever it is we're hearing. And it's, we can notice in any experience at a museum or in a concert hall or at a theater. Theater's a little different, of course, because there's obviously a narrative. But we can get stuck in our conceptual mind and kind of analyze it and, critique it and all that. Or we can just be with the experience and see what shifts. Um, and then there's the whole, from the artist's point of view, it's like, what is that experience? How are they experiencing the process of art, of making of art, or of the composing music? Is it? And so, this is a big discussion, and neither of us are artists. And greetings to the Carolina and Steve, who've just shown up on here.
Yeah.
How do we work with this?
Well, and also, I mean, I think, are we open to considering downsides? Because at least from some of our, early texts, there's, we have to say, as you've mentioned, a certain amount of problems that the Buddha saw with art, at least aspects of it, and art of his day, that it might be a route towards sensual indulgence of a certain kind that would pull us back into samsara and get us more into that sort of greedy mindset of wanting more beautiful things to surround us with.
Right.
Which I think I would certainly say I understand. I mean, I'm very partial to artwork and understand the idea of sort of wanting to have beautiful things around. And when you want beautiful things, you're going to have to pony up the money sometimes. I mean, they're expensive, and
Yeah.
I mean, certainly going to a concert or an opera, those are expensive. I mean, these are,
Sure.
and they cost a lot of money to prepare and to present. And I mean, there's a whole industry, and not to mention museums, a huge industry of massive amounts of money behind all of it. So I think there's a reason why, I mean, again, how we work with this, how we practice with it is another thing. But there's a reason why I think the Buddha was somewhat skeptical, at least of aspects of art. So that, for instance, he did not want his monastics singing or dancing.
Right.
He also talks about, dancers or um, people who are actors, because they were the same thing in his day. But he talks about them as being people who were potentially misleading people by fomenting greed and anger in their audiences. So all things, I think, to consider. And there's also the difference, which we can find nowadays very explicitly, as I mentioned, but also in the past, of a difference between the beauty of the art, which is sensual and we experience directly, and perhaps the message of the art that may be dharmically important. So, for example, we can think of, Japanese, a beautiful, the idea of the cherry blossoms, for example. Cherry blossoms are gorgeous. They're beautiful. So there's a sensual aspect of that, but there's also the other aspect of, which is dharmically relevant, of the poignancy of something that is not permanent, that is passing away. So that is also, and so we might be able to say, okay, there's the sensual part that could be problematic, but if we sort of overcome that by understanding its dharmic relevance, maybe it's okay. I mean, these are all things,
Yeah, and of course, in Zen practice, or in many Zen traditions, this the creation, the the creation of a line drawing or a Zen
circles, yeah.
Yeah, I'm blanking out. That the whole, there's so much related to the beauty of the beauty of the process, but also the mindfulness involved in doing it. Right? It's like, where is the mind? It's like a way of focusing the mind is on that, not necessarily to be perfect, but just the process.
Yeah, there's a comment here from Tony McDowell that I have heard many artists refer to creation of the art as being a spiritual practice, which I think
Sure.
is what you're talking about.
At the same time, I have heard many artists talk about the suffering of creative blocks that happens, right? Because you want it to be
Yeah.
a certain way. Perfectionism gets in the way, of
Yep.
course.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, I mean, and then Carolina writes, it can be painful when you are striving for creation as an artist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And other times it just flows naturally. Right. And the striving is the, when you realize that you're striving, and then you let that go, what shifts. Somewhere, and if we had decided this a few days ago, I would have pulled out these quotes I have from various artists about the creative process. And
Mm.
I think there's a beautiful quote by Keith Jarrett, the pianist, and who's it complete, his work is all improvisation for the most part, and just kind of letting go into that. And there is something really beautiful about improvisation. And Cy Twombly, the artist,
Mm. Mhm.
who just does these amazing, did these
Doodles.
amazing pencil.
Yes, or doodles. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it was just letting go into whatever is happening. And then
Well,
there's how artists respond to other artists, in composition in particular. And I mean, it's a never, we could have this discussion for hours. I do that idea of, I mean, it's interesting. One of our favorite monks is Bhante Buddharakkhita, who's a monk from Uganda, and occasionally he stayed with us. And a few years ago, he was with us, and we had tickets for something we live in Harlem, and we had tickets for something at the Apollo Theater, which is called Break-In Convention. They were having these sort of or biannual breakdancing performers, and it's since he's from Uganda, and and had actually, I think in his former life he'd been involved in the sports world or something. We just thought, oh, we could invite him to this. I think he'd really enjoy it. But of course, sense restraint. He politely said, no, I won't. Which and I. Yeah, I mean, so the early monastics, in that Vinaya, I mean, it's pretty strict.
Yeah, and also there's this, the early period is it's known as sort of an aniconic period, where there appear to be no or very few representations of the Buddha as a person.
Right.
That comes centuries
Much.
later, really around the turn of into the Common Era, is when
Yeah.
you begin to get the representation of, and that's a long story as to why the scholars believe that happened. There's a very good book about that. I wrote my paper that sort of touches on a bit of that. But I think it shows that the early monastics were concerned about the representation of the Buddha in a sort of even a quasi-artistic sense, because it could lead to clinging. It could lead to idea of reification of the person
Reification. Yeah.
of the Buddha, through representation of some kind. That there was an idea that the Buddha was beyond representation, and that all we really needed, therefore, was the Dharma in the suttas and so on. We didn't need anything else. So,
Mhm.
I mean, all these things, of course, have developed along with time. So we're at a very different place than they were then. And we have Buddhist artists nowadays. I mean, I'm thinking also of Philip Glass, who I enjoy,
Sure.
I love, who is a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, and whose music is very influenced by
Yeah.
meditation. And
Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
so I mean, there's different.
Yeah, there are quite a few,
Yeah.
and you know, so yeah, it doesn't. Um, yeah, it's really about both how we work with our appreciation, how we experience it bodily, both as creators and receivers, and and both. How is it really? What is the direct experience of the art? What is the direct experience of what we see? And I have a seeing meditation that's based on that teaching of Bahia. In the seeing is only the seen. There's neither a seeing or a thing being seen. It's just the seeing. And it's like, well, when we are just seeing something, just seeing, not naming, not conceptualizing, none of that, how does that change our reception of that which is being seen? So that, obviously doesn't just relate to art, but art is an interesting place to kind of practice that. And then you have I'm just looking at the Prajnaparamita behind me, which my partner had made when she was ordained. She gifted it to herself, and it was I think it was an artist in Bali, a woodworker in Bali, and it's really quite astonishing, like the detail that this guy put into it. And
it's
no doubt,
wood statue.
Yeah.
For people who can't see, who are listening on the
sorry,
podcast.
I forgot. Yeah, and yet the craftsmanship, and one does wonder, as he was, and I don't know what this gentleman's personal practice was, but when I'm assuming, regardless of what his practice was, that the just the care, that loving care, is something very special, and it's felt as you sort of see the piece, that, oh my, somebody made this, and somebody spent hours kind of making this, creating this, and and so can we take all of that in when we're viewing something or when we are hearing something?
And I think be aware as well of when we feel the greed arising within us, the wish to possess, the wish to own. We see a beautiful thing, we want to buy it, we want to own it, we want to put it on our wall. That's part of this, and that's where I think the Buddha asks us to look deeply and see when these are unskillful.
I'm about to experience that because we're moving and we're renting our apartment here furnished, with a lot of the artwork being left, including a really gorgeous Japanese print we have on a big wall that fits the wall, so we don't want to move it right now. And it's like, I have to let go of this for a few years. We'll take some of our rupas with us, but many of them will stay, and it's like, oh gosh, what's it going to be like? Can we practice letting go? So amazing. It was a very rich conversation, and we invite your thoughts on it. Thank you for those that have shared, because I think it's really, this is a big place of practice, both in receiving and letting go. And how do we work with that? There's, I don't want to say I have to. Sorry, I always have to segue, right?
We do.
The art of making coffee.
Yeah.
And then the art of appreciating coffee.
The art of waking up.
And so we support this show by allowing you the opportunity to buy us coffee through diggingthedharma.com, where you can just donate to support the show by buying us a coffee, which is has its own value. So we appreciate your support and are happy that you're here. And thank you guys who were able to come on as we are airing this, I don't know what you call it. It's not airing anymore because it's not going through the air. Live streaming. And until next time, keep digging the Dharma.
Keep digging the Dharma.
Okay. Take care, friends.